I think it should suffice as a warning for anyone when, regardless of which human being, refugee or citizen, is inside a hotel, families, humans, are inside 2 hotels and they get burnt, they get torched. Whatever you think about immigration, and there's a legitimate debate to be had there, if your hatred has got to a point where you're willing to torch hotels with live humans inside them, then you're no longer part of civilized conversation.
Right, well, let me tell you where I'm at.
Yeah, go for it.
So I feel like I'm obviously part of the independent media, you're part of the independent media, and I felt like there was a time when the independent media was growing and we were the place for a little bit more nuanced, rational debate, not part of the establishment, probably a little bit more free to say things. Yeah. But I feel like over the last year or two, some of those independent voices they're falling for the same mistakes of mainstream media in, I need an audience, I need advertiser revenue, what works, and it's become very ideological and just a bit shit. There's very few people out there now I'm listening to and thinking, God, you're making sense. And I've been particularly in the UK concerned that, like, we've got, I think there needs to be some more kind of conservative voices, but not radical conservative voices, just more conservative on like economics without going down the Tommy Robinson, Lawrence Fox, Katie Hopkins world of bullshit. And so, you know, like I said, I mean, I grew up in Bedford. Yeah. Very multicultural, large Italian, large Indian community. And I've got pissed off with people starting to use Islam as a scapegoat for what I think is a wider managed decline of society. So I was like, I phoned my mate Maajid, get him on.
Well, thank you. It's great to be. I'm glad to hear you're broadcasting from this studio now. I think that means it should, hopefully, between us, form the basis of a more longer-term collaboration. There's a lot to do. So. I just did the Russell Brand thing. I don't know if you saw, but that's coming out this Friday.
I saw that.
And one of the things he and I spoke about, I'll say to you as well, based on your introduction that you've just given, there is a dire need for initiatives, plural, in terms of bridge building between communities.
Yes.
We've just had these national riots, the worst riots in over, 2 decades or however long it's been, but they've been terrible. You know, I think it should suffice as a warning for anyone when, regardless of which human being, refugee or citizen, is inside a hotel, families, humans, are inside 2 hotels and they get burnt, they get torched. Those are scenes reminiscent of lynch mobs roaming the South, for example. Now, listen, I've got nothing against the South. My wife, as you know, is from the South, and I go there minimum twice a year. Just got back a week ago from Tennessee. My son was born in Nashville. All of my in-laws, they're all based in Tennessee. So, but that's something that doesn't happen in the South anymore. We've seen it resurrected in the UK, like roaming lynch mobs, looking for, in the case of Southport, a mosque to attack, or in the example I just gave, looking for refugee hotels. Now, to me, it doesn't matter if they're refugees, asylum seekers, legal or undocumented. If your hatred has got to a point, because you would have had a valid point if you're concerned about, for example, we can get to that. I'm happy to talk about anything you want, immigration, any of those subjects. None of them are none of them are beyond the pale for me to talk about with you. Whatever you think about immigration, and there's a legitimate debate to be had there, if your hatred has got to a point where you're willing to torch hotels with live humans inside them, then you're no longer part of civilized conversation. I can't even believe that I've had to express that to some people. As you may well be aware, we're going to get into names. I'm happy to. This is not for me to use this platform to point score. We can have a reasonable, civilized conversation, and preferably a non-personalized one about some of the names, and to talk about our disagreements with them intellectually. But basically, if you've got to a point where we have to say to you that it is beyond the parameters of civilized conversation to be egging on online and to be fueling the flames of a society that is in the midst of witnessing roaming lynch mobs. I call them neo-fascist lynch mobs. I'm happy to get into that term as well. But if you're online at that stage, like Elon Musk is, and you're tweeting, if you look up Elon Musk on Twitter and search term civil war UK, you'll see how many times he has goaded the concept, including saying things like it's inevitable. But what really, for me, is beyond pale is that in the middle of these roaming lynch mobs, torching hotels with humans inside them, he's on his platform with millions and millions of followers, tens of millions, goading civil war in the UK. And it's not just, this is not something we can put down to trolling or, oh, look how funny it is. This is like her, edgy online talk and basically while he's scratching his ass in his bedroom. These were families. And so when you get to that point, it's no wonder Parliament summoned him to speak. Now, obviously, we understand Parliament is itself as a cesspit full of corrupt warmongers and Blairites currently in power. That's not in defense of Starmer and his Ukraine warmongering or whatever. That's not in defense of that. What we're talking about here is, of course, there's a bigger thing, there's a bigger game at play here. And if you've got somebody as influential a voice as him, with a platform as powerful as his, which is ultimately what I described on Rogan 1780, is a weapon, we've now seen how it's been weaponized. So if anyone goes back to my conversation with Rogan 1780, you'll see me use the word weapon to describe Twitter. I still call it Twitter because I'm not subject to his whims. He's whimsical, right? Whimsical X. What does he think he is? Malcolm X. But basically, the way that platform's been weaponized, you can see it. So when he recently did the thing with Brazil, and they've banned his platform. Again, this isn't to say let's ban speech. This is to say, why should I defend you now in the name of free speech when what you're effectively doing, Mr. Musk, is the equivalent of what Tony Blair did when he said, let's invade Iraq to defend democracy. Like, let's be a bit careful here. Like, you're weaponizing our values to defend free speech where you want us to. Since when did he criticize Israel? So he's all over Brazil at the moment, and he wants us to jump in the name of free speech to defend him. Since when has he criticized Netanyahu? Instead, he went there when he was summoned. I've got a piece on my Substack called Kneel Before Zod. And it's basically
Superman.
Musk was summoned by Netanyahu, who is Zod, right? And kneeled before him. And did the whole kind of photo op thing with cradles and, where are the dead babies? The Jewish Chronicle, I've just published, I just posted it. The Guardian, Sunday Guardian is the Observer in the UK. The Guardian just wrote a piece today because the Sunday Times wrote a piece about it. Their investigation exposed it yesterday, that the Jewish Chronicle in the UK, the oldest Jewish newspaper in the world, has had to sack one of their hired columnists for putting out fabricated pieces about the Gaza war, right? So a lot of propaganda has been revealed, fake news has been published by outlets, including the Jewish Chronicle, and Musk has been there at their beck and call when Netanyahu summoned him. Here is the headline: Crisis at Jewish Chronicle as stories based on wild fabrications are withdrawn, right? That's in the Sunday Guardian, the Observer, because the Sunday Times, another reputable, but obviously with criticism, UK corporatist news outlet, exposed what was going on. So my point with Musk is, we're not going to fall for the same, we say in, there's a tradition in Arabic, Muslim tradition, al-mu'minu la yuldaghu min juhrin marratain, yeah? A believer in the oneness is not bitten or stung from the same lizard hole twice. So you did that before, like under the guise of Tony Blair, let's defend democracy and invade Iraq. Now it's about defend free speech and work with Musk, to weaponize that against the countries he wants. So I'm not interested in defending Brazil's banning of speech. I'm interested in saying, why should I stand with you, Musk? Because you're no different. You're on the other end of that dialectic, weaponizing speech for your own purposes. And what we saw with the riots in the UK is a case in point. Ultimately, if there are ongoing riots in any country, then the only civilized response is to ask for calm, is not to encourage people to burn down buildings with live humans in them, smash up mosques with families praying in them, like lynch mobs literally outside mosques, yeah? Of course, then you wonder why a whole bunch of Muslim black shirts came out.
Of course.
Right? So what do you think was going to happen? So, my point is, if you're going to be critical of the BLM riots and say, look at these mostly, the whole mostly peaceful.
Mostly peaceful.
Right? And you've got pictures of burning buildings behind you and a CNN reporter saying mostly peaceful. You're doing the same thing. I understand there's a difference between peaceful protesters who oppose immigration and support, for example, the Reform Party, right? I understand that they and Farage and others wouldn't want anything to do with the likes of Stephen Yaxley Lennon. They've made that clear. Farage left UKIP over that point and said, I refuse to be leader of UKIP while Stephen Yaxley Lennon and UKIP under Gerard Batten are going in the direction of Stephen Yaxley Lennon, stage name Tommy Robinson.
I love the fact that you're using his real name.
So at the end of the day, that's why people don't understand that outside of the UK. They think Stephen, stage name Tommy Robinson, and Farage are in the same camp. And because they're in the US, they just think it's all Trumpism in the UK is Stephen Yaxley Lennon, stage name Tommy Robinson, and Nigel Farage. What they don't realize is the reason Nigel Farage left his own party, UKIP, the banner under which he campaigned for Brexit for such a long time, most people still know him as UKIP, right? And founded the Brexit Party and then founded Reform. There's 3 stages to this. Why did he do that? He left UKIP because Gerard Batten basically adopted stage name Tommy Robinson as an advisor and started taking UKIP in the anti-Muslim direction. Farage quit. That's in The Guardian. Anyone can look it up. Go and search online, Nigel Farage leaves UKIP, and you'll see a big headline over anti-Muslim bigotry. Then what happens? There's the very recent leader of UKIP, literally the one that was just there, left again.
Is that the lady?
Yeah. Left over Tommy Robinson.
Yeah.
Stage name, Tommy Robinson, Stephen Yaxley Lennon, right? Right? Because again, and did an interview saying there's no way I can stand as leader of UKIP when they're pushing us to go towards the kind of anti-Islam direction. So there's an internal debate among the right in the UK right now about this, because nobody wants riots who understands what's going on in the UK. Nobody wants the civil discord. So then the question becomes, who does? Who does want it? And this brings us to, some interesting, I'm happy to go into as much detail as you want, but some interesting patterns behind the voices that recently emerged that have been promoting Yaxley Lennon, stage name Tommy Robinson, while he was goading all of these recent riots. And those voices have one thing in common. They've all been summoned by Zod. They have. So Jordan Peterson, who's been promoting Yaxley Lennon, stage name Tommy Robinson, at least Jordan uses his real name, he's been obviously he's at the Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro. That's a very well-known pro-Likudnik, which is Netanyahu's party, Likudnik outfit, right? So when you start looking at that, Musk was summoned by Zod himself, the head of the entire Likudnik phenomenon, Netanyahu. So whether it's Musk, whether it's Peterson, you can start recognizing that one thing they all have in common, those that have been goading and agitating for communalism and sectarianism in the UK, they all have one thing in common, and that is they are pro-Gaza war and pro-Likudnik policy in Israel, led by Netanyahu. And that's where, again, the UK Times, exposed this all. I was saying it for a long time on Radical Media, on my Substack, and that is that there were Likudnik, Netanyahu interests behind these divide and conquer policies. And again, the UK Times, with my criticisms of corporate media, did an expose on the funding behind Yaxley Lennon, and it revealed that all of the funding sources come from pro-Likudnik backers. Rebel Media, I know all these guys personally, by the way, because I have a personal history with Stephen, having helped him once upon a time leave the EDL, which again, happy to go into, and all the story behind that. But my idea at the time was to try and help end what was at the time Europe's largest anti-Islam street protest movement. And by removing its leader, some in the media from our organization at the time unfortunately used the phrase decapitated, which he didn't like because he felt it was a bit jihadist. But somebody said we decapitated the EDL. That's perhaps an unfortunate use of phrase, but yeah, remove the leader, left it as a headless chicken. Sorry to conjure up images of decapitation again. And as you know, Peter, the EDL has never been the same since in this country. Now it's a one-man band run by Yaxley Lennon. And this recent surge of his kind of, online profile has been aided because of his Twitter account.
So do you believe the goal here is to create anti-Islam, anti-Muslim sentiment in the West as a cover to encourage people to be more supportive of Israel continuing in the war in Gaza?
So yes, but more than that. So that's a primary objective, and that is that if you've got a very large anti-Muslim sentiment across the West, then the funding stream you need to go for Israel's war in Gaza is easier to acquire politically. Now, how if you think of that by a way of an analogy, you need to generate anti-Russia sentiment to continue the funding stream into Ukraine for that war. You need people to think Putin is a boogeyman, that he's nasty and is all dictator, tyrant, for people to be willing to tolerate the fact that we, in the meanwhile, are cutting winter fuel allowance for our elderly while our successive governments, not just Starmer, but before him, the Tories, have been promising literally unlimited funding for the war in Ukraine. So you've got to generate that sentiment so that the public is pacified to accept the fact that we're going to fund war. So in the case of Ukraine, that's anti-Russia sentiment. In the case of Israel, it's anti-Palestinian sentiment. But of course, there aren't many Palestinians in the West. There are stateless people living in refugee camps. So their strongest supporters in the West are the Muslim diaspora. So you've got to generate an anti-Muslim sentiment to continue, and more than just a fear of Muslims, and generally a fear of migration and brown people, because a lot of our migration was coming from countries that we were involved in wars in, which were Muslim majority countries.
And so hold on. So when we see pro-Palestinian protests and campaigns, often seen within community groups, such as like student groups, there was kind of like a patronizing tone of voice against these protesters, these people kind of pro-Palestine. And I kind of felt it a bit weird because a lot of them were quite young. And I think as a young person, it would be weird not to hold some form of sympathy for Palestinians.
Yeah.
And so is that part of it as well?
Is what part of it?
It's part of it. So the kind of patronizing tone of voice given towards protesters.
Well, what's part of it is beyond patronizing, is more than patronizing. What's part of it is to muddy the waters between a pro-Palestine sentiment and a pro-terrorism sentiment.
Yes.
So the equivalent is me sitting here now talking to you, Peter, and saying Jews this and Jews that, instead of Likudnik Zionists led by Netanyahu. Why am I saying that? Because the largest protests in Israel's entire history, a country founded in 1948, its entire history has never witnessed as large as it's currently witnessed in terms of protests against its Prime Minister Netanyahu, who refuses to go. So think UK anti-Iraq war protests, yeah? Mm-hmm. So we understand that most of Israeli society is against Netanyahu, but because of the nature of their political system, he's in a coalition government without majority support. But to muddy those waters and say Jews helps if somebody wants to paint all Jews with the same brush for the purposes of marginalizing the Jewish community. So if you want to marginalize an entire cause, that's what's going on. It's like, oh, these are pro-Hamas protests. Absolutely ridiculous. The evidence used, by the way, is that some of them chant from the river to the sea. Now, Elon Musk is guilty of this. He put up on Twitter that anyone, alluding to the fact, paraphrasing, that from the river to the sea is a terrorist chant, and anyone posting it will be banned from Twitter under its terms of service, right? It's bullshit. It's absolute bullshit, Peter. Anyone listening now, look up Likud Party constitution. That phrase began in the Likud Party's own constitution. They were talking about Israel from the river to the sea. Okay.
I mean, look, it may sound simplistic, but I have a very kind of simple view in this, is that the Palestinians have been treated terribly for decades. We know land has been stolen. We know, Gaza is an open prison camp. We know the health system has broken down. There's very little chance to build a business if you want to go outside of Gaza and work. It's very difficult. I know this, and it's very hard not to be sympathetic. And I believe the Palestinians deserve a state, and they deserve proper leadership, and they deserve to be free. And I think Hamas is a terrorist organization. I also look at Israel, and I think the country now exists. We can't remove Israel from the map. Israelis deserve to live in peace, and I think Netanyahu's government is a terrorist organization. I see them very similar.
He's their Tony Blair. It's not hard to understand. Yeah. What you just said is correct. He's their Tony Blair.
But I don't understand why people can't be nuanced enough to see sympathize with two civilian populations who just want to live in peace, and why they have to use ideology to pick a side. I don't understand.
Because we're not being allowed to sympathize. The people that control the narrative channels and the platforms are deliberately promoting voices that sow division so that war can continue. So I'll give you, by way of an example, back to my interview with Rogan in 1780, which laid all this out. And it demonstrated, for example, in the UK, we have the 77 Brigade, which is part of our military psychological operations unit, led by Tobias Ellwood, MP, who's a lieutenant colonel, not led by, he's a lieutenant colonel in charge of the psychological operations, also a parliamentarian, and he's in the 77 Brigade. Now, if you look up Tobias Ellwood this week, he's on air saying, let's ignore the Americans and allow our missiles, NATO's long-range missiles, to strike into the heart of Russia. They want war, and they're engaged in psychological operations to encourage it. One of the things they're doing is making sure that only those voices that promote division and a lack of nuance and war are heard online and promoted by the algorithms. So since my interview with Rogan in 1780, for example, by way of an example, and this isn't about, bitterness, this is because it's bigger than me. And that's what is really important to understand. I'm literally just an example here. My account's frozen at 500,000. Hasn't gone up since, right? Which defies all odds, by the way, but doesn't matter. I don't care because I know truth takes a life of its own. Mm-hmm. But what happened in the meanwhile? Robinson gets stage name Toby Robinson, Stephen Yaxley Lennon gets reinstated by Musk, and his account goes from 0 to over 1 million within a year. Now, there's only one way that happens. When other accounts that have been consistent and consistently calling for peace with receipts and daily posting news and analysis, doing a proper job of journalism, their accounts are frozen. This guy goes from 0 to over 1 million. He's goading riots online and he's still on there, right? So what that case demonstrates is the reason you're not hearing that nuance is these platforms, Musk, because he was summoned by Zod, have whatever they have on him, we go into Epstein if you want, but there's a global compromat network that is involved here, and it was run by Mossad. Epstein was a Mossad operative, and the British press have also started reporting on that. You can look it up. Look up Epstein, Mossad. It's all in the news now. The problem is that these articles come out and then the algorithm doesn't make sure we are reminded of them because the algorithm is hiding them. And so what's going on is that they're only promoting voices that are sowing division. So when you think of Muslims now in the UK, right? Anyone, just take the average person to think of Muslims in the UK, and they're going to think of the worst thing they've just seen online. Somebody talking about whatever, behead the apostates or whatever, because that's what's being pushed. And so we've got this constant reminder, it's like advertising, that the other, we don't agree with. The other is evil. Now, one of the things I said to Russell just now in his chat is that, and he just released this clip about this, but if you think about it, it's insane. We've got like take Muslims and Christians as an example. Every single prophet that Jews and Christians believe in, Muslims also believe as prophets and messengers and revere in that status as prophets and messengers, all the way up to Jesus and Mary. There's an entire chapter in the Quran revering the mother of Jesus, Mary. Upon her be peace. We can't even mention her name without reverence, right? We are taught to say, peace be upon him, to Jesus, to Mary, to Abraham, to Moses, to all of them, Adam. And so you've got everything there is shared. And yet, despite that, the phrase you hear when describing Western civilization, despite the fact that a lot of the philosophies and the ancient Greek texts were, when Europe was in the quote unquote dark ages, it's a bit of an unfair term, but it's used, so I'll use it. The dark ages of Europe, those Greek texts were preserved in the Middle East, right? And were retranslated from Greek through Arabic and were reintroduced into Europe through Andalusia, Islamic Spain, when the Moors were there for 900 years. That's the reason those texts were then preserved and reintroduced back into Europe. Despite all of this, despite all of that shared theological background, people like Jordan use the phrase Judeo-Christian civilization. And that's what I said to him in my chat with him. Like, why are you doing this? Why are you literally amputating a limb? You've got an entire chunk of the world that is Muslim, like at least like whatever, like out the three, the fastest growing one out of the three Abrahamic faiths, right? And you refuse to acknowledge any contribution. Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Jabr al-Khwarizmi invented algebra. Cipher comes from sifr, the Arabic for zero. And you wouldn't have modern mathematics without the concept of zero, which is a joint Indian-Arab development, yeah? And there are untold examples. I can, you can carry on. Pythagoras and all of that resting on original Arab mathematicians. And so why this deliberate framing of Western civilization being Judeo-Christian, excluding Muslims? Again, it comes back to who has a vested interest in making sure that we are at odds, that Muslims are seen as the other, so that they are basically seen as a fifth column within our societies. Who gains? Who benefits from that? And that's where we find ourselves.
Well, we should try and do the reverse then, because as a probably I was christened, but I'm not really. I would consider myself an atheist, and so I don't have any religious ideology. everyone's my friend. So I would like to do the opposite today. But, I've got a whole section in my notes on unity and collaboration. I kind of want to go against what the corporate media does and what a lot of these kind of new independent journalists do, which is monetize division. I want to go the other way. Bedford, where I live, like I say, it's very multicultural. We have a massive Indian community, a massive Bangladeshi community, a huge Italian community. I've only known a multicultural society. It's all I've existed, and we've had no riots. We've never had any issues. Yeah. So and I come into London, and there's the range of cuisines you can go to, everything from Somalian to Jamaican. And again, I love London. I think London's great. I know it has its issues. Yeah. I don't want to allow the voices of Tommy Robinson, Stephen Yaxley to dominate and be able to create divide. I don't want them to use isolated incidents as examples for all Muslims. It's not fair and it's not right. And I think the majority of society is fed up of what's going on. And I just think, let's do the opposite. Let's try and break down what they're doing, and let's try and do the opposite. Because I cannot stand by and watch these people monetize division. Yeah,
monetize. That's hate. What they're doing.
We've got to move beyond this. Yeah. And obviously, you were the first person I was going to speak to, because we spoke before. Yeah. You've been on that journey. You went from radicalized and reformed, and I don't think there's a better person for explaining and helping people understand Islam than you. And you've also done the work. You've got the receipts. You've been out there. You've tried to help. I mean, you're probably better to explain it, but the work you've done in trying to unradicalize people.
Well, so this is important, because people hear me and they might think I'm sitting there just defending Muslims. Yeah, and I'm being tribal. But Stephen Yaxley Lennon, stage name Tommy Robinson, knows that not to be true, right? So there are legitimate grievances on all sides of this community discussion we're having. So for the last, in answer to your question, up until COVID, for about 15 years, we founded, and I was pretty much the kind of front man for an organization that was what we billed as the world's first counter-extremism organization. The idea, Quilliam was the name, named after a man, William Quilliam, who became Abdullah Quilliam, who was one of the first Englishmen to embrace Islam in the 18th or 19th century. Anyway, Liverpool based. He kind of built an orphanage, a mosque, and people remember him fondly because he basically became a man of charity and education. So we figured, hold on, this is a indigenous and kind of relatively old example of a British Muslim. And we wanted to make sure that people, Muslim and others, felt that there's a version of Islam that can exist here in Britain, a manifestation of Islam that can be at home in Britain. So we named it Quilliam, and for about 15 years until COVID, we were at the forefront of trying to provide a policy, media, and community-based response to some of these narratives that had emerged that were pro-ISIS and before that pro-Al-Qaeda. Now, I want to say at this stage that, of course, there's criticism. There always is. And it's never easy doing that kind of work in your own communities. And especially during the war and terror years when it felt very sensitive for communities. It felt for them like we were airing the dirty laundry in public. I think that in hindsight, post-ISIS, more and more Muslims have started to understand why we did what we were doing. One of the things they didn't understand at the time, generally, was that while we were doing that work, I referenced it earlier, Yaxley Lennon was, stage name Tommy Robinson, was leading the EDL, the English Defence League. At the time was Europe's largest anti-Islam street protest movement. And they were engaged in things such as marching through areas like Whitechapel, which, people outside of the UK need to understand just what that means. It's like, whatever, you take a march through the heart of a community, like an anti...
It's like the Orange Order marches.
It's like exactly that. Or an anti-Confucian march through Chinatown. It's just in your face, in your community, through your own community's neighborhood. And of course you have a free speech and free assembly right. To pick that route is deliberately done to incite. And you're correct. In the Northern Ireland context, it's like the Orange Order marches going through Catholic neighborhoods. And it understandably causes community tensions. So we were in a position at the time, Yaxley Lennon said he wanted to leave the EDL. So one of the things we did during that period of time and work that we were doing against extremism was that he approached us and we said, okay, we'll help facilitate your departure from the EDL. And that's how I know exactly who was funding him. and exactly where the money was coming from and where it's coming from today, because I had an intimate relationship with this story from back then. He did eventually leave the EDL. The EDL has never, the English Defence League has not been heard of since then, because it pretty much withered away without his kind of symbolized as the head of it. And for a while, he was visiting mosques with some of our people and engaging with Muslim communities in mosques, learning from them. And for a while, it died down to a point, Peter, where during COVID, I thought there was a bit of hope for him. Now, this is what I'm saying, the Muslim community, there was criticism there because they didn't like the fact that we were seen with him. Yeah, and we were trying to do what we do with jihadis, what we do with far right, what we do with anyone, which is, if you say you want to change, sit with us and we'll help you change.
Education, collaboration.
What else is there? Violence?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So after COVID, I thought there's a bit of hope from him. He put out a video, and people can find this online. A lot of Muslims saw it anyway, so they're aware of what I'm saying. He basically said on video, in a podcast like this one, you know what? I had it wrong. I thought Muslims were the main enemy. Actually, globalists are the main enemy. And after COVID, I've realized that there's a system here that is trying to take away our freedom, and they're pitting us against each other. He said this on video. So I met him in Whitechapel, the very area they used to march through, right? Very heavy Muslim population there. He was kind enough to come and see me, and we had some food, and I spoke to him, and I said, I'm encouraged by these sorts of noises you're making, and we had a nice chat. Then October 7th happened, and that's where it went pear-shaped, because his funding was coming from people like Ezra Levant, Rebel Media, Canadian-based Likudnik backers, and others, and they took him on a tour in Canada recently, and for whatever reason, after October the 7th, it's almost as if he got activated again. And he went down a particular line. But back to Quilliam, that's the kind of work we were engaged in. Now, whether it was on, as I said, on the kind of populist right or anti-Islam right, to be more accurate, side, or on the jihadist and Islamist side, and to define those phrases briefly, an Islamist, people have their own definitions. All I mean by that phrase is not Islam, which is a faith community. Islamism is the desire to impose any version of Islam over society. So it's the politicization of my faith, Islam. And somebody who follows Islam is a Muslim. What I say is somebody who follows Islamism, I call an Islamist, i.e. somebody who wants to impose a version of Islam over society. Islam believes that jihad, which is struggle, is a religious concept. What does jihad mean? Jihad means struggle either in terms of physically to defend Islam, it's like in genocide like Bosnia, or in fact, I'll go so far as to say if somebody's trying to burn your mosque down, right? It's a jihad to defend your mosque and your community. And so that's defense. But the greater jihad, what we know as jihad al-akbar, is the internal struggle for perfection. So that's jihad. Jihadism is the use of force and violence to bring about Islamism. So that's how I differentiate between the terms. And somebody who engages in jihadism is a jihadist, whereas somebody who engages in jihad, i.e. the kind of inner struggle or self-defense, is a mujahid. They're very different words there. So ist and ism I'm adding simply to the end of existing Islamic phrases to kind of denote their politicization. So what we were challenging was the ist and the ism of it, the politicization of it. That's where initially it was difficult for some Muslim communities to stomach, because it was the early days of the war on terror. Tony Blair was prime minister, Bush was president. I just got out of Egyptian prison. And it hadn't been done before from within our communities. There hadn't been an indigenous response to some of this. And as a result, of course, it was a mess. There were some things were well received, other things were not well received. But that took us up to COVID. I shut it down. But the motivation, the desire, and the need for that work remains. So what we're trying to do...
Can I just ask, how big a problem, and I'm sure it's different here in, say, the UK compared to in the Middle East itself, but how big a problem is Islamism? Is it a niche problem? Is it something which is attractive to young people who are maybe a little bit more nihilistic or need identity? How big an issue is this?
So the thing is, it's less now since ISIS.
Okay.
What really, and you can see why and how, and the fact is it was done on purpose, but what really kind of gave it a boost was the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And before that, in Afghanistan itself, the war against the Soviets who invaded Afghanistan, because Al-Qaeda was founded there. Bin Laden was basically a known CIA operative. There have been confirmed CIA operatives involved in the 9/11 incident. And so the entire thing was initially a CIA-backed resistance front against the Soviets in Afghanistan. It spawned from there after the invasion of Iraq. It kind of went global. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq before we invaded Iraq. That's just a fact. And this is, take it from somebody that's advised governments around the world on this. I'm talking highest level, Downing Street, White House, Homeland Security, all around the world, different governments. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq until we invaded. Under the banner of Quilim, I've done this work professionally, and I can credibly say pretty much was the reference for policy for most Western governments on developing counter-extremism strategic direction. So I say this with authority. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq before we invaded. After we invaded is a different story, and it ends with ISIS in Iraq and Syria.
Is that because of the vacuum created?
You create a vacuum, and you also create the grievances that are there that are then exploited by ideologues to recruit. Ultimately, if someone invades your country, it's very easy to convince you to fight them. I mean, it's not that hard. If somebody invaded Britain, I'd fight.
The humble bee, a keystone species crucial to the survival of Earth's inhabitants. Here's how things would look if bees vanished. And here's how they'd look if humans vanished. It's a tough pill, knowing the Earth is better without us. But imagine if instead we became a keystone species by doing things the right way, by taking responsibility for our actions and becoming the solution. Iron mines the world's most responsible currency the right way. Because the future depends on it.
I mean, it's just pure logic that if you see it here in Gaza. If you blow up a hospital, blow up a school, if you blow up a housing block, you kill 20 people, 30 people, you create a bunch of people who, again, are going to be angry. You're going to create new people who are going to want to fight. It's just natural. It's someone punches you in the face, you want to punch them back. I mean, this is just such basics.
Basic. So since ISIS, back to your question, since ISIS, they're kind of self-destructed. As with most extremists, they go too far. And because they're hate-led, hate doesn't have, it's bottomless, right? So it ended up eating itself, which is what ISIS was. It ended up fighting Al-Qaeda even, right? So that kind of, a lot of Muslims were watching that and they realized what's going on here. And in addition, what the ISIS thing in Syria also did is it revealed that even Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is to Israel's north, there's a Hezbollah issue there with Iran-backed militia. Because they backed the Assad regime, most Sunni Muslims used to revere Hezbollah before ISIS in Syria because they were fighting Israel. Then they start looking as they start realizing who's been weaponized by which regime. Yeah. So whereas Hezbollah was pretty much founded and funded all through its life by Iran, Hamas has been backed originally by Israel and recently Qatar as well. But Netanyahu had a long-standing policy of funding Hamas, right? Again, I'm mentioning this as fact. Anyone doubts me, because I do this work professionally and have done so on a senior level, governments and everything, so it's fine. Look it up. You'll find it for yourselves. Otherwise, just go find my Substack. I've got all the receipts on there, yeah? But this is a Game of Nations. Miles Copeland wrote a book called Game of Nations, and it describes this. This is basically a Game Player and Game of Nations are two books written by Miles Copeland, old books, but nevertheless, they're about spycraft globally, and it's literally a chess game, people moving pawn pieces. Netanyahu basically wanted to fund Hamas, and he's on the record explaining why. And this is in Israeli press. So whenever I speak, what I do is I don't use references that would be contested by the person listening, to understand that if I'm going to say Netanyahu funded Hamas, this is from Israeli press sources that are also not just left-wing Israeli press.
I know. Yeah? You're famous for your receipts.
Right. So why did he want to fund Hamas, right? It's because he didn't want a Palestinian state. Mahmoud Abbas is the head of Fatah in the West Bank, was a Palestinian president. He wanted to create and fund a fifth column in the Palestinian nation Hamas so that they would start fighting each other and that the world would agree with Netanyahu that if you grant them a Palestinian state, it's going to be run by terrorists. So he decided it was in his chess game strategic interests to promote Hamas at the expense of the secular Fatah government in the West Bank. Fatah was the party that Yasser Arafat used to lead. It's now Mahmoud Abbas is there. So that's on the record, right? So it's a bit rich for Netanyahu, for example, to say that anyone who supports pro-Palestinian causes is pro-Hamas, when actually he's literally the guy that was pro-Hamas right up until October the 7th, yeah? Likewise, Hezbollah in Lebanon was Iran-backed. Now, what the Syria and ISIS conflict allowed many Muslims to realize is they suddenly became multi-dimensional, whereas prior to these conflicts, many of my fellow Muslims were a bit black and white. It was like, you're with Muslims or not. They started realizing that there's a bigger game at play here, which is why also actually a lot of my work's resonating a lot more now, because people are beginning to realize actually there's a bit of a point here that he's trying to explain, which is that we were being played. We were all being played across the spectrum, yeah? Played to what end? Those that globalists, and Netanyahu's a key globalist, but it's not just Jews, Tony Blair, Catholic, right? Keir Starmer, and it's not just Labour. Right, so Michael Gove in the Tories, all these are globalists, and Boris Johnson. So Biden in the US, these are all globalists. They're all part of a kind of a network that is seeking to keep politics within a specific crime cartel. Time magazine described them as a cabal in a piece entitled "The Secret History of the 2020 Elections." The word cabal was used to describe these people, but Time was trying to praise them instead of criticize them, right? So let's call them a cabal. There's a cabal, and Kamala Harris is part of this cabal. And what they do is they make sure that any selection that's presented in front of you is a short list. When I went to design my home that I purchased before COVID and tried to move in during lockdown, I said to my wife, who's an artist and a musician and a lovely person, why don't you pick all the interior design? So what she did is, with her artistic eye, she made sure that I only saw a short list of stuff. My attention span was only so limited, right? So she was like, okay, here's 3 different colors for the curtains. Which one do you want? Okay, A. Now, that's what they do with politics. They make sure that you only have a curated shortlist of people you can select. The Jeremy Corbyn being deselected in Islington with Diane Abbott's saga in the last elections is a case in point, where Starmer wouldn't even let Corbyn run as a Labour candidate, right? The former leader of the Labour Party was kicked out of his own party and wasn't allowed to run under a Labour ticket. That's how they operate. Now, I've opposed Corbyn, but the point here is that if you're going to curate a limited number of people that we can select, don't tell me you're not a cabal.
Well, they did it to Bernie Sanders in the US as well.
And Kamala Harris. This is back to Kamala Harris. So there wasn't a primary election. They selected her from on high to represent the Democrats. She was the first candidate to drop out of the primaries because of how unpopular she was.
But it's the same. It's the same as not allowing for proportional representation.
Yeah. So
it's the same thing.
What's happened as a result is that this cabal, they fund division on all sides so that they remain in power, so that our voices are so disunited that we can't get together and actually elect somebody that represents us because we're busy fighting each other. Meanwhile, they step into the middle of that division and select their representative from on high. And because our voices have been disunited, we don't have the unity of purpose to challenge that.
And we end up sounding like crazy people.
Yeah, that's right. But you know what? More and more people are beginning to see this now.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. But that's, again, why it's really important that we have elevated, articulate, good speakers able to come out and unite people with nuance, but facts. And it's really difficult. I do want to go back a step.
Yeah.
So back, I asked you how big a problem is it? You said it's not such a big problem.
Used to be a bigger problem.
But is it still an issue?
Yeah, of course it is.
And is it a spectrum of extremism from some people who just don't want to mix with outside of Muslim communities up to people who are quite radical?
Yeah. So in my dialogue with Sam Harris, which turned into a book and a Amazon Prime documentary as well called Islam and the Future of Tolerance, I kind of went into some of this spectrum. And we've got to understand where there isn't an issue and where, in fact, some of it should be encouraged, and where there is an issue and should be discouraged. And even that is within the parameters of law, and then what's illegal. That's the spectrum, right? So what we're looking at is Muslims who are, to use Western language, it's limited, but we can kind of get the point, religiously conservative. I have a problem with the word religion even. I mean, I'm more on a spiritual path, but that's a different story. So let's use the constraining language, at least. It gets across some of the points we're trying to describe. The religiously conservative Muslims are the overwhelming vast majority who basically believe in things like marriage, family, don't drink, don't do drugs, pray as much as they can, minimum every Friday, but you're going to pray 5 times a day. And that's, if you're a Muslim, you should be really praying 5 times a day, to be honest. That's the basic minimum you can do. Fasting in Ramadan. That's the vast majority of Muslims. If they can, they go on pilgrimage to Mecca. It's expensive these days. If you can afford it, go. And give charity. Those are the basic 5 pillars. Of course, all of that built on the key point, which is you believe in the one source, Allah. In Aramaic, the word Jesus used was Allah. Arabic is the longest surviving and living derivative from Jesus Christ's language, Aramaic. And the word Allah in Aramaic means Allah, which means God in English. Again, God is loaded, but the source, the kind of infinite energy. So this is the basics of a Muslim. The vast majority of Muslims are that. They're religious conservatives. Within that then, in terms of sort of concentric circles, you've got a smaller one, which is those that are Islamist. Now, we've just described what I mean by that. So those who believe in imposing a version of Islam over society, Islamists, yeah? Within the Islamists, even then, the vast majority are what I call political Islamists, which is those who believe in doing that through the ballot box, such as the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, who, for a brief period after the man that imprisoned me, Hosni Mubarak, and his interior minister, Habib Adli, were put in the very same jail cells they held me in, and the Muslim Brotherhood came to power. It's a funny story. Their spokesperson, unfortunately named Jihad, but that's, the official spokesperson for the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt when they're in government, and his name was Jihad. But anyway, Downing Street calls him over. David Cameron was PM at the time, and they called me in. And I was like, okay, what do you want? And they said, well, Jihad's coming. And this is a true story, Peter. Yeah. Cameron says, and listen, so Cameron's sitting there. So I've got to get through the story without cracking up.
I'm sorry.
Listen, they've got these beautiful mahogany sofas in Downing Street, right? The head of MI6 is there, Sir John Sawes, David Cameron, and the Tunisian version of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hizb al-Nahda. So the founder was Rashid Ghannouchi. His daughter was there. So this is the peak Arab Spring, when all the populations are uprising, all the Arab rulers are getting overthrown, and the Islamists are coming to power, but they're democratic ones, not the extremist, not the violent ones. So in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood got elected, and it's why I'm telling this story, and it's why I'm making the point that even if you take out the issue that they want to impose a version of Islam over society, they want to do so through democracy and elections. So there's a conversation to be had with them at least, yeah. So their guy Jihad gets appointed as their spokesperson, and he flies over and meets us in Downing Street. And I say to Sir John Sawes, head of MI6, I say to David Cameron, what is it you want from this meeting? And they're like, listen, honestly, the world's just changed overnight. These guys are in government. We need to understand what our foreign policy should be like with Egypt now that the Muslim Brotherhood are in charge. I said, cool, okay, fine, let's talk to them. So that's the kind of work we used to do, right? So he turns up. We have a very good conversation, to be honest. And he, you can talk to these guys. Now, I disagree with the Muslim Brotherhood's vision. I am the kind of Muslim that believes that the change has to start from within us. There's a passage in the Quran, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيْرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيْرُوا مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. Allah doesn't change the situation of a people until they change themselves and what's within themselves. Okay. So nevertheless, there's a conversation, as I'm saying, to be had with them, and especially since they're in power. So we have a chat with him. The guy flies back, and then, of course, what happens next is the Egyptian military then overthrow the newly elected Muslim Brotherhood government, and then General Sisi comes to power, and he's been in power ever since. Jihad gets thrown back in prison. So now Jihad's in jail. But he was the spokesperson at the time. Now, take that example. The Muslim Brotherhood are not the majority of Muslims. In Egypt, they were elected, but in the first round of election, they got about 20% of the vote. So you can kind of gauge their support from that. The rest was all kind of, list system and whoever then qualifies for the next round. So their kind of popular vote was that first round. It's about 20%, yeah? And that's in the context of a country being under a military dictatorship since the assassination of their previous president, Sadat, in 1981, right? So of course, there's going to be that kind of swell of support for any opposition. And even at the peak of what you'd expected them to have got in terms of votes, they got about 20%. Which qualified them in that first round. So you can gauge the level of support for the Islamist version through elections in that vote. And even then, so that's not a majority, and even then, they're people you can talk to. The ones you should be concerned about are the ones that are then the jihadists. We defined that earlier, the use of violence to bring about Islamism. Now, they're a tiny minority. And since ISIS, at least, that's been roundly discredited because now they're all fighting each other. Al-Qaeda hates ISIS, ISIS hates the Taliban, you see.
It's a race to the bottom.
Yeah. So really, it's the Islamists we're talking about.
Yeah.
And the Islamists are most represented in terms of the most popular and widespread group is the Muslim Brotherhood. And I'll tell you, having spent time in prison in Egypt with their leadership, Dr. Mohammed Badir, their current leader, and I think he passed away. I think he did. I can't recall. Don't quote me on that. But I was with him in jail, Dr. Mohammed Badir, and others from that leadership. And I know them all personally. You can have a conversation. They're not the people that are going to blow up the hotels and stuff, right? They don't want to blow up trains or planes. That's not what they're about. They're about winning elections. So you can have a conversation with them. Like in Northern Ireland, we had a conversation with Gerry Adams. And Sinn Féin. So that's the issue. Now, so it used to be a bigger problem during the war on terror. The fact the war on terror has wound down, the fact we're now out of Afghanistan, the fact that hopefully soon we'll be out of any wars, if we get this right, I'm expecting that problem to die away. What I'm expecting to be a new issue, a bigger issue going forward, is less Islamist extremism. And again, I don't mean Islam by that. What I'm expecting a bigger problem going forward to be is a kind of the debate we're having in Europe now about immigration, integration, citizenship, and identity. That's going to be the key thing. It's no longer going to be about kind of, Islamism and the war on terror. It's going to be about who's British, who belongs in Britain, and who should we let in, who shouldn't we let in? Should there be kind of, deportations, which some people obviously, as you know, the kind of Yaxi Lenin types, get them out. So that's going to be the conversation going forward. It's going to be more about cultural identity. So in that context, even there, because I said earlier that there are some positives to the religious conservative Muslims, I want to go there. What are the positives? Well, in the context of the cultural debate, Muslims will be in the front line of defense with everybody else in Britain, for example, against the sexualization of children, which is a big topic. For example, against the abuse of power by the state, because, of course, we've been on the receiving end of that, right? So Muslims have been on the front line on the civil liberties debate, on the anti-kind of sexualization of children conversation, on the concerns around war and foreign policy. So there's still there, in terms of the cultural debate, there's still a lot to build bridges with, even with the religious conservative Muslims.
But what you're saying is there's a lot of alignment with values.
100%. The need for strong communities, the need to rebuild families and start, the population crisis, families and children and marriage, and kind of trying to somehow reduce our promiscuous culture and consumption and consumerist-based culture. Religious conservative Muslims are going to be on side with all of that stuff. So, having safe neighborhoods. At the end of the day, if you remember the riots before these ones, remember the ones that started in Tottenham and spread across the country through WhatsApp. Yeah. Many of us heard the stories at the time when those mobs that were looting stores came to any neighborhood with Muslims. So they came to Whitechapel. All the Muslim brothers came out of the mosque and they basically, those mobs walked away. They didn't want to fight Muslims.
Of course not.
Yeah, and the Turks came out with the kebab knives and they said, you're going to try and smash my store up. And basically all these hood rats walked away. They're going to start that. Try to fight with the Turks in North London, see what happens to you. So basically, these guys, Muslim communities where they've settled, another bridge I'm saying to build is if you want safe communities, right, and you want to basically deal, for example, with knife crime, Muslims have been at the forefront of safe communities. My cousin in the Machete gang attacks in Southend, the Southend Machete gang.
Yeah, I saw them.
Yeah, so look up Imran Salimi, BBC. He runs about 4 or 5 big news agents outlets. They're called Big News in Southend High Street. It's my cousin. He was raised in my house, under my roof. He was a national badminton player for the Pakistani national team. He unfortunately got cancer. He had to quit his badminton career, but he was on the national team, like national level, international level badminton, a long time ago, many, many years ago. Like, you know, I was like 15 at the time. So he came here for cancer treatment, lived in our house, basically ended up staying married here, married a French woman, had kids. He now runs multiple news agents in Southend High Street. When those machete gang attacks happened, he was on the street defending his shop fronts with all his staff. So basically, Muslim communities can be and are allies in safer communities, for example. So there's a lot of bridge building that can be done. And so when all of those key issues people are concerned about, again, I said this to Russell as well. If we stop obsessing with where we disagree and the negatives and start instead looking at where we agree and where the positives are and what we share. There's a professor in Georgetown, used to be at Georgetown, I don't know if he still is, I hope he still is, but his name was Fathallah Muqaddam, and he had a paper called Omniculturalism. And he recognized that under Blair in the Labour years, the new Labour government, multiculturalism ended up with our communities growing together apart, like a fork in the road. Yeah, so we were having parallel growth and we weren't talking to each other. So he said, look, there's a problem with multiculturalism in that sense that we're not having these sorts of conversations in communities where people are reaching out and trying to build bridges. He said omniculturalism is to say, all right, point 2.0, yeah? Let's, instead of focusing and celebrating our differences, which is one model of multiculturalism. I mean, I did political theory at the LSE and there's many, you know, Kim Licker's a multiculturalist theorist. There's many multicultural theories, but ultimately in practice, it ended up being that we were celebrating our differences. That's how it was implemented under kind of New Labour years in the UK. And Fathallah Muqaddam, professor of Georgetown, his point was, let's try and tweak it. We start celebrating what we share instead of celebrating how we're different, while keeping our differences. You don't want a bland, homogenous, you know, robot society. No. So you keep your differences. You know, I don't want, like, you know, I want different communities. I don't want, like, you know, I don't want to convert everyone. That's not the thing. I'm married to a US Catholic went to Catholic school Kundalini practitioner called Rachel, white, American from Tennessee. You know, I'm not trying to, I'm on some conversion mission. Yeah. So let's, you know, keep our differences. But his point was, but let's celebrate what we have in common. So, for example, my wife, who went to Catholic school, back to that example, you know, I get on. I mean, I love her parents. Her mother is a church-going Catholic every Sunday. And what I do is I talk to her about the respect and reverence I have, and Muslims have generally, for Mary, for Jesus. For example, Muslims believe in the second coming. Now, a lot of people don't know that there's so much that we share with practicing Catholics and Christians generally, you know? So let's focus on what we share. And that, I think, goes some way to healing some of that divide we saw recently with these riots.
It must be frustrating for the more moderate Muslims who have integrated well into society, you know, run businesses, to constantly feel like they're being persecuted for the actions of the Islamists.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like, are you ever British enough? You know, like the problem I've got is I opposed the stripping of Shamima Begum's passport, Shamima Begum, the so-called ISIS bride, on a few grounds. And I've explained this, you know, and I'll do so again, I'm very happy to. Before I got cancelled off LBC, I was trying to explain this on air then, and it was being met with a great deal of resistance. And my point was, the grooming gangs in Rochdale and other towns and cities were cases in the UK where organised groups of Pakistani men who were essentially drug dealers and criminals were basically exploiting underage girls that were vulnerable and living in care homes that therefore didn't have parental oversight and guardianship and guidance. And they were exploiting them by getting them hooked on drugs and basically then sexually exploiting them. And many of them were underage and the men were in their 30s and so on and so forth. And it was disgusting. And that, again, look up my name. You'll see I was the first UK national broadcaster to bring that to the national airwaves. Yaxley Lennon, stage name Tommy Robinson, built part of his reputation off of campaigning on that issue. And by the way, on that issue, there's a British Pakistani broadcaster who's now on Good Morning Britain, Adil Ray, who was the comedian, what's his name? Citizen Khan?
Okay.
Yeah, Adil Ray was him, yeah? And he's now a Good Morning Britain presenter. He did a documentary on grooming gangs. So British Pakistanis are trying to address the issue. The prosecutor that sent them all to jail was a British Pakistani prosecutor. So those three examples, myself on LBC, Adil Ray, who did the first documentary on it, I did the first national news commentary on it, and the prosecutor himself, Nazir Afzal, I think it was Nazir, was his name Nazir? Anyway, the prosecutor, British Pakistani. So, they are addressing it, but Stephen E. Axley Lennon also built his reputation off that case. But if you look at what we were concerned about there, it was underage girls being essentially groomed, online or off, and then basically being exploited sexually and drugs and all sorts of things. Why is that relevant and analogous to the Shamima Begum case? Because if you look at what happened, she was 15 years old when ISIS convinced her to go to Iraq and Syria and marry one of their fighters. So that's a underage girl that was groomed online and then trafficked. Because anyone you transport across borders at the age of 15 for the purposes of a sexual relationship with another man, that's the definition of trafficking. So she was a trafficking victim. She was 15 years old, Shamima Begum, the so-called ISIS bride. Yeah. What did they do? Her babies died in detention. She's still there, and they took her passport. They stripped her of citizenship and tried to lump her onto Bangladesh, her parents' country of origin. Now, she was born in Britain. The Bangladeshi government said, whoa, hold on a minute. You want us to take your export? Like, this is somebody born in Britain, and because of, she didn't have a Bangladeshi citizenship. And so the British government, because it's against international law to say, to render somebody stateless, they said, we're not rendering her stateless because she can get a Bangladeshi citizenship. The Bangladeshi government turned around and said, oh, no, she can't. Don't speak on our behalf. We're not going to give her a citizenship. So they rendered her stateless, which is against the principles of international humanitarian law. And my issue with this was, back to your question, like how British do I have to, how do I prove myself to you, right? Is that there's an example where you've taken a underage trafficked girl who is British and therefore is our problem, disagree as we do with ISIS. And I'm concerned that we never stripped passports from Irish terrorists, basically, that had dual citizenship. We never stripped the passports of, say, Terry Venables and all the Jamie Bulger case or any other gruesome mass murder or paedophilia case. And so we did it with Shamima Begum. And it's very concerning to me, because if you're going to get to a point where you're saying that, even if someone's born here, they can lose their citizenship, then citizenship isn't then a birthright. It becomes like a visa that can be taken away.
Is it just soft racism?
Well, I think the public acceptance for it is, unfortunately, there wasn't an outcry. And I think that And
is it part because ISIS was so brutal and savage?
Yeah, you can shock people bounce people into that position. Unfortunately, though, that was done. But I think there is part of what complicates the conversations. There are legitimate conversations that are needed to be had about things like immigration, about things like extremism, about things like identity and integration. Yes, there are legitimate conversations need to be had about that. Now, I'm not party political. I used to be. In 2015, I ran as a Lib Dem because the well-known Paddy Ashdown, the late Paddy Ashdown, was my political kind of godfather or mentor. And I liked him, and I liked what he did in Bosnia. And I was initially radicalized because of the Bosnia genocide. And so I joined the Lib Dems. I stood as a Lib Dem parliamentary candidate in Hampstead and Kilburn in 2015. But I left that party, and I'm no longer party political. And with that caveat, I'll say that what we need political parties that adopt stances we disagree with. We need that, right? So we need a reform led by Nigel Farage that isn't Stephen E. Axley Lennon, just like we need a Labour that isn't led by Keir Starmer, right?
Yeah.
So we need that, because there will always be people in society that like to smoke in pub gardens. Like there will always be people in society that like to, for example, Labour, well-known kind of flagship Labour policy kind of issue is, but Nigel Farage likes to smoke in pub gardens. Yeah. But whatever the Labour. So there will always be, what I'm trying to say is left-wing people and right-wing people. You can't pretend that or wish that away. So we need responsible parties that are going to represent the masses of those who are right-wing and the masses of those who are left-wing because if you don't, then who fills that vacuum? The Axley Lennons will come and step into that space. And on the Labour side, we've seen in recent history where that can go. If there isn't a responsible left-wing voice, it ends up becoming very almost, kind of black pill, they call it on the black pill debate. Yeah, very kind of anti-Semitic, everything, anti-Western, everything to do with the West, and then almost kind of Islamist jihadist. And you don't want that. You don't.
Yeah, but I mean, I didn't vote in this last election. I haven't voted. I think in certainly the last 2, maybe the last 3. Because I feel we've come to this place now where we have the Conservatives and Labour there's very little to separate them.
Yeah.
They are both high tax, high borrowing, a high debt surveillance state.
Yeah. In other words, cabal.
Well, yeah, it is. It is because what is the difference between the Conservative and the Labour Party? It's ideological differences, and I think the main issue is. Most people you get into the pub, you don't really know them. If you don't talk about politics, you probably get along with most people. Yeah. But once you get into politics, you realise you've been ideologically kind of gaslit into disliking certain people, so you vote. It's almost so the politics has got so weird. It's become like sport.
Politics is marketing.
Yeah, but it's become like sport. It's like I want to win at any cost. Do do they honestly believe they're best for the country, or do they want to win at any cost? And I don't know if there's. I cannot find a political leader I look to and think you're someone of credibility. You're somebody of integrity. I did quite enjoy Stephen Baker's exit speech when he lost his seat in High Wycombe, and he talked a lot about. But I just feel because I think my background. Mine's been mainly looking at the economics and the money, and I look at how much debt the government's got. I look at the OBR report that says it's going to triple within 50 years. Steve Baker himself said the welfare state will collapse in 20 years. We cannot afford, as a country, to live with such a large, expensive state. It's failing us.
And yet they're sending billions abroad for war.
Yeah, but billions for all kinds of bullshit. Yeah. Everything is falling apart. The NHS doesn't really work very well anymore. And I just look at it now and think we're broken. Yeah. We're broken, and because we're so broken, the only thing they have is the culture war to make us hate each other.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to not let them win, not let them do this. I do. So the integration's an interesting thing. I think it's very easy to look at the Muslim community and find people to help with integration because I guess you've got community leaders, you go to mosques, there's people like yourself, But who's on the other side who's meant to do it?
Well, also, another thing I said to Russell, which I'll say to you, which is integrate into what? Yeah. So if you want me to integrate into the kind of society that can force me to take medical experimental jabs against my will, I refuse to integrate into that kind of society. If you want me to integrate into the kind of society that could, against my will, sexualize my child, I refuse to integrate into that kind of society. If you want me to integrate into a society that can, upon lies, ethnically cleanse an entire population while our taxpayer-funded money funds it, I can't integrate into that. So what's happened since COVID, and the work we did with Quilliam that we've just mentioned, on trying to develop a British Muslim identity it precedes me. I don't need to kind of explain what work we did on that, and it's well known, and anybody that doubts that can look it up. But a lot of people that, at least if they've heard of me, know how much we cared about that debate of British Muslims, integration, and British values. What COVID did is it kind of demonstrated, and I kind of posted this just as that began. I said, look, I've spent the last 15 years. Showing you the underbelly on the Muslim side. Now I'm going to show you the other side. And that's what I started to do, is that, look, this is a two-way problem. Because yes, on the Muslim side, there are obstacles to integration. But if you say integrate into what, the COVID thing kind of laid it out bare, that we've got a state that can literally, based on lies, force you to put a gag over your face, lock the entire country down for extended periods based on lies, coerce you to take an injection with God knows what liquid is inside it based on lies, and then while you're doing all of this, tell you you're only allowed out for 15 minutes a day, and they're literally partying in Down Street and Hancock is shagging his mistress on CCTV in government buildings. Now, what I find hilarious about this is if anyone's read Animal Farm, now all of us in school had to read that, which is a great thing. We had to read it in school because that's why this reference lands. And that is that if you remember, how does the book end? The pigs that take over the farm, it's great they're pigs. The pigs that take over the farm are on hind legs in the mansion, partying and drinking alcohol, while the animals on the outside who are told you're not allowed to stand on two legs and you're not allowed to mix with humans, are looking through the windows, and the pigs are drinking in a party in the manor farmhouse with humans there, and they're standing on two legs, the pigs are. So Animal Farm ends on that note, and it was poetic justice that Johnson, Hancock, and all of them got caught partying in government offices while we were locked down, watching them from the outside, because we were run by animal farms and the pigs had taken over. You see, so if you want me to integrate into that, then you'll see what happened. Basically a resistance emerged.
I think therefore it's possibly it's probably a different question then. It's this emergent, because I know there's a lot of people at the moment who are pissed off. A lot of people don't know why. I don't know what the problem is. And I still think, as we came to that last election, even though voter turnout was lower, I still think there was that kind of mindset, well, they've been shit, I'll vote for these and things will get better. And they're not going to get better under Labour. I think soon people are going to realise. But there's no alternative. And I guess what there is, it's like you've alluded to, there are shared values that a conservative Christian, a conservative, and when I say conservative, I don't mean politically conservative.
Same.
I mean morally conservative
morally,
and economically conservative. Shared values that we can all have. And the integration comes from creating a force around those shared values, which rejects this, like I say, big government, censorship happy, surveillance state, which is growing our national debt at such extreme levels. I don't know if I always talk about this one because it's the one that blows my mind. The debt we pay on the interest we pay on our debt is more than we spend on education. I think it is getting around these shared values and integrating based on that and rejecting
100%
this lying political class.
Very important that you don't lose this, okay? This is your inheritance through Bitcoin.
Let Bitcoin rip. Don't rip up your Bitcoin. Set up inheritance with Casa.
The challenge ahead of us is because this is managed. You use the phrase controlled demolition, and that's what's going on. Our society.
Oh, no, I said managed decline.
Managed decline, right. So it's a controlled demolition, managed decline.
Yeah.
The idea that, so this is collapsing, the edifice that had and it's much of it was theatre that was governing us. It's all being exposed. So in the Wizard of Oz analogy, like we're beginning to see behind the curtain is this kind of weak, feeble man that was surviving using illusions. And the illusions aren't as strong as they used to be. So we're in this moment now. What we need to do is, and it's not the phrase integration, depending on what we mean, it could work as well. But essentially what we need to do is start redefining what we stand for, what we believe in, and then building a new future together is basically what it is.
Yeah.
And building new communities together based on the new realities we find ourselves in. And those new realities have never happened before in history. Those new realities include things like Essex boys like me, born and raised in Southend, moved to East Ham at 16 and been in East London ever since, claiming I'm British while being Muslim. That's not a reality that Britain had to deal with 100 years ago. But it is now. It's a fact on the ground, and there are thousands of us. So those facts on the ground require a new discourse around this. And how we do that is up for grabs. And who does it is up for grabs. It has to be done if we want a country left, right? So the fact, though, that the state can't do it, I think you and I would agree on.
The state definitely can't do it.
Yeah.
And I think parts of the corporate media can, but large parts of it can't. The BBC is always in a tricky position. I'm not completely 100% against the BBC. I think the eyes they have on them force them to at least be marginally responsible in some areas. I'm not like one of these Americans who hates the BBC and sees it as state-run TV, even though it kind of is state-run TV.
Yeah.
But I think it has as many issues as Fox Media has and Sky has and Murdoch has, and I think there are some similar skewed incentives from this new kind of rise of independent journalism. But I do think it will come up from the independents, and it will force the corporate media to change. I think look, you've been on Rogan. I think he's done a brilliant job at this, as an independent voice. And I think we need more of that. And we need to rally around the fact that the enemy isn't each other. You're not my enemy.
Yeah.
Muslims aren't my enemy. And the enemy is the people who are forcing us to hate each other.
Yeah.
The people who are monetizing the divide, the people who are telling lies, whilst robbing the future of our our generations. I mean, I look at I've got a son. My son's here, can't buy a house.
Yeah.
How the fuck's he going to buy a house?
Yeah.
Houses have become assets because they print so much money.
Yeah.
So it's doing that. I don't know how, but it's that. That's the change I want to see.
And I think we can, building that from bottom up, community up, through conversation and, more important, relationships, is the way it has to be done. Politicians will always trail and lag behind on that because they are reactionary in the sense of they respond to voter demand, right? You have to first create the demand, the voter demand in the first place, which requires those relationships in communities. Now, in that process, there are, unfortunately, certain red lines. The Britain we need to build from here, and, let's, I think, agree whatever the old order was is dying, right? Yeah. So the Britain we need to build from here, if it's to be maintain a certain level of respect and prestige on the international stage, the Britain we need to build will have to have certain red lines. So uncivilized discourse, such as we need to remove Islam completely and entirely from the UK now. That's paraphrasing Lawrence Fox's post during the recent riots. The only way you can do that, remove Islam completely and entirely. I mean, should I get the exact quote out?
Get
the exact quote so that we know exactly what we're saying. Lawrence Fox, and the reason he's relevant, he's not above criticism. He's a leader. Let's remember, he's a leader of a political party, right?
Is he?
Reclaim.
Is he?
Yeah, Reclaim.
I thought he lost to Count Dustbinhead or whatever his name.
Yeah, no, but he's still the head of his party, though. I mean, Reclaim is still a political party. So,
but he lost to a Dustbin.
He did, yeah. But that what I'm saying is that's why I mean, you can criticize the guy. It's not like a private citizen, right? So enough is enough. Yeah, here's the direct. Just so you know what we're reading for. Here's a direct post on Twitter.
Here we go. Here we go. It's up here. Enough is madness now.
We need to permanently remove Islam from Great Britain completely and entirely.
How would you act? I mean, even if you
now,
thought that.
The date there, right? 29th. So literally, that's the day before the riots.
Yeah.
So what happened when he posted that is I said, can we meet? I need to talk to you.
Oh, yeah. You privately had a private conversation.
Yeah. Well, no, it didn't happen because I said, can we meet?
No, you privately reached out to him.
Yeah. And I said, can we meet? He said, yes. I said, I don't want to make it difficult for you. So name a time and place does this area, does Shoreditch work? Was the actual area. Does Shoreditch work for you to meet? He said, yes. And this time, yes. I said, okay, you sure Shoreditch is okay? I want to send you out your way. No, it's fine. Okay. 2 hours before the meeting time, he tries to move the location. And I had already said to him, I told him, explained it. I had a follow-up meeting after that with an old childhood best friend. And we were off to a gig together because De La Soul were performing.
Oh, nice.
And we were guested. He's a DJ. He was support DJ for Farside, who were also on stage at the time. So it was Farside, De La Soul, and who else was it?
I didn't know you were so cool.
I mean, I grew up on the hip hop scene. So my mate, Big Sav, he was the DJ for the Farside after party. Anyway, so it was for the main gig, which was in Crystal Palace, and we were guested, and we were going, and he was meeting me, and I said, all right, let me just chat to Loza, and then you come and meet me in the same venue. So I couldn't move the damn thing, right?
Yeah.
And I'd already moved around family commitments. 2 hours before the meeting, he decides to switch up on me. Because the thing is, that post couldn't be defended. That's the point. And he knew it couldn't be defended. Because if you say remove Islam completely and entirely from the UK, right? What is that? If you think about it, because the defense is, I'm not saying Muslims, right? That was the defense online. Oh, no, I'm not saying remove Muslims. I'm saying remove Islam. All right. What does that mean?
You're banning a religion.
What? Remove Islam means what?
Close all the mosques?
Close all the mosques. The next day a mosque gets attacked in Southport.
Yeah.
Right?
Are you going to ban praying?
Yeah.
Are you going to ban the Quran?
Are you going to stop people looking like Muslims? Like, what does it mean, remove Islam completely and entirely?
Well, my question to him is, okay, walk me through how you do this. Just walk me through how you do this, and you don't come across as just a fascist.
And any step you take in that initiative meets the definition of ethnic cleansing.
Yeah.
There is no way you can do this without Bosnia-style religious cleansing. Let's not even say ethnic cleansing because Islam's not a race, all right? Religious cleansing, yeah? You cannot remove Islam from Britain without religious cleansing. That's Bosnia, right? And I said to him, you're going to come up against a brick wall, which is what happened. It's going to be a brick wall. It will be an immovable object, right? So this idea of let's build a new Britain, there will be red lines. And, it doesn't matter whether Lawrence Fox accepts this or not, whether Stephen Yaxley Lennon, his mate, accepts this or not. There's nothing they can do about it because the facts on the ground are here. People like me exist here, and they're going to have to get through us if they want to remove Islam completely and entirely. It's just not going to happen.
I think it's more than that. Yeah. There's reasonable people like me that are going to have to get through as well, because I just refuse to be sucked into this bullshit. Yeah. I just refuse. Like I say, it does not reflect my childhood. It doesn't reflect my adult life. And look, don't get me wrong. Look, I haven't lived in marginalized communities, and I haven't. I've had a fairly privileged upbringing, not like ridiculous, but my dad was working class, but a decent standard of living. I haven't had a tough upbringing, but I refuse to be sucked into this. What I think is, I think it's, I still see it as racism, even though you say Islam's not a race. I think it's people who don't like people different from themselves. I think it's a way Tommy Robinson's rebranded himself so he's not called racist.
Well, and stage name Tommy Robinson knows, as does Lawrence Fox, that I and we, those that we work with, are very happy to have a conversation on all of these issues, grooming gangs. As I said, look it up. Mm-hmm. I was the first national broadcaster in the UK to expose this on the airwaves, So yes, Yaxley Lennon, stage name Tommy Robinson, there is a legitimate conversation to be had about grooming gangs.
But hold on, the grooming gangs, let's just be clear, so I understand this. These might have been Pakistani individuals, but they can't be respected practicing Muslims.
No, some of them try to use their Muslim identity once they got caught to claim.
They're just criminals.
To claim, yeah. Some of them tried to use their Muslim identity once they got caught to claim Islamophobia. You're picking on me, which is what dirtbags do, right?
No, you're a paedophile and a criminal.
Yeah. Now, the legitimate conversation to be had about this is why weren't the arrests made on time? Why was the local label council covering up for them? And the answer...
Because they were scared?
Well, more than that. If you follow the evidence up, the chain or the food chain, you end up with, members of the House of Lords that have been accused of paedophilia themselves, right? In that area, yeah? So it's, it is all kind of Epstein-esque in that sense. So, yes, there are legitimate conversations to be had. And Lawrence Fox and Stephen Yaxley Lennon, stage name Tommy Robinson, both know that we accept there are legitimate conversations to be had on these. So this isn't about being in denial or trying to suffocate that aspect. This is us saying that you can take those legitimate grievances and you can weaponize them the way in which in the invasion of Iraq weaponized the defense of democracy. That's what's going on. Mm-hmm. And the proof of that is, all right, Stevie, Yaxley Lennon, stage name Tommy Robinson, talk to me about the Mossad-run global VIP pedophile ring that Epstein was involved in. And he hasn't once. And I've tweeted him this. And you want to talk about grooming? That's old news. We dealt with that. We not dealt with it, but we kind of exposed it publicly. And you did too. Fair play to you. Credit where credit is due. Now let's talk about the global one. You're worried about pedophile rings in Rochdale and other Rotherham and these places. The global one that had Prince Andrew connected to it, that had, all manner, the Clintons involved. Let's talk about that one and who was behind it. It was a Mossad operation. Why? To control politicians with compromat so that you could force them to do your bidding. That if they didn't do your bidding, which was a war-based foreign policy, you'd expose them publicly. And the threat of that exposure is why they constantly voted for more and more funding for wars abroad. That's what that paedophile ring was about. But Stevie, Yaxley Lennon, has refused to discuss that once. Or let's talk about Tate. At the end of the day, if you're so concerned about underage sexual exploitation and trafficking, why is it you're still mates with that bloke? At the end of the day, yeah, all right, he's innocent till proven guilty, but there's innocent till proven guilty, and there's, is that somebody I really want to be mates with? They're two different conversations. I'm not saying he's definitely legally guilty, but there's enough bullshit there for you to surely, just like if you brought me to any of those Rochdale Pakistani men, I could tell you from the first meeting what they're about. I wouldn't start being best mates with them. So what's going on here? Why is him and Tate are mates? And then again, you follow that trail, you start realizing what's going on. So Tate recently, when the riots happened, the network exposed itself. All of them simultaneously started claiming that the murderer of those children in Southport was a Syrian Muslim asylum seeker. Tate said it. Stephen Yaxley Lennon, stage name.
Lawrence Fox did it as well.
That's right. Stephen Yaxley Lennon, stage name Tommy Robinson.
But this is
said
one of those
an
problems
asylum
with
seeker.
Twitter. People see a tweet and they retweet it without doing their research. I've got caught in that. I expect, you come to realize that you can't just shoot from the hip with Twitter.
Well, especially when it provokes riots.
Yeah.
You know, that's the, so here is, there he is. He has been named, that's the screen grab of,
Has he deleted this now?
no, that's the funny thing about it. That when I said, you got to meet me, and then the meeting he didn't turn up to.
He has been named as Ali al-Shakati. Is that pronounced that correct? I'm not a specialist on derivation, but that sounds like an Islamic name.
And of course, that's bullshit.
Yeah.
It turns out he was a Welsh-born,
Yeah, Kenyan parents from Kenyan
Yep.
origin.
Yep, and was not a Muslim.
Yeah,
Right? So the concern I have is none of this has been deleted, let alone publicly acknowledged as being wrong. It's not even been deleted. And so then you start thinking, okay, here's the thing. We're not having honest conversations.
but it goes back to my point: is like who are your leaders? Who are your role models? Who are the people you can look to? It's hard to look to politicians. There's literally nobody in there who's got any integrity or respect. There's no one there. If you who's created a voice for themselves for the people who feel like something wrong but they've got no answer. You know, it's your Lawrence Foxes, your Tommy Robinsons.
Well, they've been promoted online.
Yeah, but I also think there's not enough people coming forward with a nuance, non-ideologically driven view.
Yeah.
And you know what? In fairness, Constantine's done a fairly good job. I think he's done a fairly good job in some areas of trying to be nuanced and he's done okay. He's done fairly well.
I wish him luck.
Yeah.
I do think there is a need for those voices on all sides. I
Yeah.
do think there is a opportunity for us to build this new Britain, agreeing as we do that the old order is dying. Back to the red lines, it needs to have a very firm. It needs to have a very firm understanding of what red lines are, and uncivilized discourse, such as removing entire communities from Britain, is a red line. Provoking riots and sectarian hate and communalism, essentially trying to bring the troubles from Northern Ireland to Britain, that's a red line. Outside of those red lines, which is basically promoting violence, which I'd say on the jihadi side, I mean, our track record speaks for itself on that. Outside of those red lines, we've got to find a way to not just tolerate, but respect and encourage views we disagree with because we recognize they're needed on a macro level. So what do I mean by that? In the last election, I live in a safe Labour seat. So I protest voted because I sympathise with your perspective. There's no one really that inspires me. So my protest vote went to the Workers' Party, Galloway's Workers' Party, because I was so angry about Gaza. While I posted that was my vote because it was a protest vote. There's no point. I'm in a safe Labour seat in London. There was nothing else I could, that would affect anything. So that was a protest vote because I was so angry about Gaza. But I posted at the same time that meanwhile, I think Nigel Farage may well become Prime Minister of Britain, and I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. Why? Because recognizing as I do that nationally, this tends to be a right-of-centre country, generally. Culturally, it's a right-of-centre, small c conservative country. Now, Starmer I knew was going to become PM anyway, so I'm looking beyond that, what's going to happen. I'd rather an anti-war small c conservative PM than Michael Gove, Tom Tugendhat, Tobias Ellwood faction, who are cabal. The thing with Nigel is, and there'll be things you disagree with him, my main concern is, how do we end up in a situation where we recognize that the health of a country and its democracy requires right-wing voices and left-wing voices who don't betray the country? That's when I'm looking at it from a macro perspective. That's what I'm interested in. And yes, betraying the country is, of course, is subjective. My main concern there is who are not basically sending us to war on behalf of foreign interests, back to the cabal and Netanyahu and all of that. So if we can recognize that, does Nigel Farage fit within the red lines or outside of them? Well, him and Lois Perry, who was the UKIP leader I mentioned earlier, who left UKIP because they were, as leader of UKIP, she left because she didn't want it to go down the Stephen Yaxley Lennon stage name Tommy Robinson route. A leader before her did the same, and then Nigel Farage, as leader of the UKIP, did this. 3 leaders of UKIP left because they didn't want to be associated with the anti-Islam direction. That, for me, is evidence enough that with including the concerns people have about their views on immigration or whatever, and Brexit, I voted reform. I voted Remain in the Brexit debate.
I did too.
Yeah.
A last minute change as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So, no, I was active Remain campaigner and then conceded when we lost. But regardless of what we think of their Brexit thing, yeah, What I think we have to recognize is when we realize we're trying to build a new Britain, in that new Britain, there will be right-wing, left-wing views. Now, those right-wing views have to have parties representing them that are serious about conservatism and dealing with some of the problems. Nigel Farage has just appointed as chairman of Reform, Zia Yusuf, who is a British Muslim. I spoke to him on the phone after he took the position. And that indicates to me something, that they're trying to send a message. Now, if you're Nigel Farage, you're not stupid, right? You're Nigel Farage, right? You're literally probably one of the most consequential politicians in our generation, yeah? And you put a Muslim as chairman of a British Muslim as chairman of your party. And you're saying, in next election, 5 years, I'm going to be PM. So what you're telling me is that the person that's going to build your national infrastructure to make you PM is a British Muslim. And when I say British Muslim, I'm not talking of the kind of like, the kind of not really Muslim type. He's somebody who, I spoke to him, he's like, yeah, listen, I grew up, faced racism. Yeah, I'm Muslim, but I'm British, and yeah, I like this country. So he's not hiding the fact he's a British Muslim. He's not embarrassed of it. Yeah?
It's going to confuse a lot of people, this.
Yeah. So take that list of evidences I've just given, yeah? The 3 leaders of UKIP that left because UKIP has gone down the whole Stephen Yaxley Lennon stage name Tommy Robinson route, yeah? Nigel being at the kind of most prominent of them. But even Lois Perry, she did an interview on Talk TV about why she left and went into it and said, this whole Tommy Robinson thing has a very dark underbelly and I'm warning the country against it. And she quit UKIP after 2 weeks of being a leader. It kind of tells you, what do they know that we don't know? All of these people that have left as leaders of UKIP because of Stephen Yaxley Lennon, yeah? So when you put that together and realize that and Lois then joined Reform, right? And then they then appoint a British Muslim as the chairperson, I think we've got to be generous enough as people that came from me and the Lib Dem trajectory, voted Remain, we've got to be generous enough politically to recognize that they are signaling to us that they don't want to cross certain red lines. We've got to be generous and recognize that. Mm-hmm. So in building that new Britain, the generosity of spirit has to, who we can work with that we perhaps politically may disagree with, has to recognize that. Otherwise, you're not building a new country, you're building a new faction. I'm interested in building a new country, not a new faction. I think, the factions need to exist within countries. But what right now we need to save our country.
Yeah.
And so that means being a bit grown up and thinking a bit more, as a monarch perhaps would, as to, like looking at a macro and saying, what does a country need to function? Well, it needs a serious right-wing option that isn't cabal, that isn't globalist, isn't pro-war. Farage, one of the first things he did if you remember in that election he just won, he said, I don't agree with the war in Ukraine, we need to stop it.
I think there's a job that needs to be done as well on educating what like conservatism is, conservatism is and isn't, because I can vote for this Conservative Party. Yeah. The Tory aspect of the Conservative Party is not something I identify with. I'm a big fan of conservative approaches to families. Like one of the things I was discussing on the way with my son is like, the reality of like my daughter, if she doesn't have a child by the time she's 30, she's got a 50% chance of having a child. So one of the things is I want her to be free and have a career and believe that she can do whatever she wants and she has an equal role to play in society. But by the way, if you want to become a mother, you have to think about this earlier on in your life. That to me is a conservative value. I'm conservative about 100%, economics. 100%. I'm conservative about, access to social media for children now. I understand what that means. The sexualization of children, all this stuff. I'm very conservative about it. I'm not a Tory. Yeah. I'm conservative. I'm actually quite progressive on some issues. Yeah. So, I do think we need that because unfortunately, conservatism has been seen as being a Tory. Yeah. I mean, I'm a single man. You go on a dating app, they say no Tories. Swipe left if you're a Tory. And it's like, how do you explain something? Look, I have conservative values.
Can I give you a word for it? Can I give you a word? Traditionalist.
Traditionalist, that's a good one. And
that's where I am.
Hey, and that work when you're dating. I'm a traditional man.
I'll take you out. It might not work on dating apps, but
I think that will.
Oh, you think it will?
Yeah, I think traditional will because it's traditional values.
Okay. Well, I don't know because I'm not on the dating apps. I'm happily married. But yes, I think traditionalist is a word that describes, and I'm there with you. I think,
because so when you say right wing is a pejorative these days. Yeah. So, you're right wing. Yeah, yeah. It's a pejorative, like you're some kind of white supremacist, and it's not true. I mean, you're going to confuse people. As someone who's pro right-wing policies, who is a British Muslim, you're going to confuse a lot of people.
Well, Zia Yusuf, and that's why I'm happy he's there. Because no, I would describe Reform as not just a traditionalist party, though they are, but they're also right-wing in the non-pejorative sense. And I think Galloway is a traditionalist on the left. And what I'm finding is developing is that the anti-establishment voices on the left and right tend to be traditionalists, and it's why they're anti-establishment, because part of traditionalism is to be suspicious of a big state, because a traditionalist is more interested in big community, which Cameron tried to call big society, if you remember, yeah? But it was an attempt to usurp this phenomenon, which is that people that understand that strong communities are actually the bedrock of a strong country. And in the olden days, right, we used to have strong community. Yeah. And what's eroded that is corporatism, because corporatism cannot survive if you have strong communities. You need weak communities in the sense of highly mobile workforce, mobile labor that you can move around the world depending on which resources you need to exploit and which talent you need to send to whichever country to exploit those resources. And it requires unattached people who are willing to move around the world and work from their laptops and don't really have a sense of belonging anywhere. You know what is described as the people that are from somewhere versus the people that are from nowhere. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that kind of dislocation or atomization of individuals serves corporate money. And it's a highly mobile workforce that ends up basically living to satisfy itself and its own desires and pursuits in the form of consumerism. And its kind of extreme manifestation is what we see with the online culture, in the kind of worse represented by Tate, but, basically big cars, fancy flash, whatever, and women and whatever. So that online culture is corrosive to communities. Promiscuity is corrosive to communities. Porn is corrosive to communities. I mean, I completely stopped all of that. Obviously when the internet first got invented, but I'll say a message to all young men: stop porn. If you can, try and find a woman and settle down with her and have a family. It's corrosive to our psyche. And ultimately, it's what benefits corporatism. So I think traditionalism in that sense recognizes the importance of strong communities to revive our country. And in that context, we need left-wing manifestations of it and right-wing manifestations of it. What would that be? So perhaps a right-wing manifestation of it would be more kind of market-driven, while still, being suspicious of like the globalist cabal. And a left-wing manifestation of it would, like Galloway's kind of anti-war message, and while still kind of having some concern about social justice. But ultimately, that's what we're looking at.
It's kind of classic liberal.
Yeah, that's right. Kind of Gladstonian, classical liberalism.
Yeah.
Because it really, as I think you've said as well, we can sense it, our state's become bloated, and we've squandered it because we've been basically printing money. During COVID, the government, the ministers, Hancock and all of these people were siphoning off money with pub landlords getting PPE contracts. The money that they put us on furlough under Rishi Sunak, we were warning at the time it would ruin our economy. They ended up printing money to cover for all that. And of course, inflation went through the roof, and now everyone's feeling it. So we've got to rein all of that in. We've got to somehow work out how to revive our financial and economic base without succumbing to central bank digital currencies.
Yeah, I mean that's a whole other thing. Yeah. I mean we'll come to that. If I could get something across to the wider public, it would be the understanding the difference between the productive and the unproductive class. The productive class being you and I, who are out there as productive people, creating wealth, creating jobs, and the unproductive class being the state, which is largely unproductive. Its productivity comes from taxation, fines, but every time you create a job within the unproductive class, you are reducing the strength of the productive class. Just having people understand that. And I'm not a anarcho-capitalist who believes in no government, but we have a massive unproductive class now, which is like a vulture on the productive people, which is, I mean, I'll give you a great example. me and my son at the moment, we're opening a cafe where I live in Bedford, right?
Well, good on you.
Yeah, it's for our football club.
Yeah.
Support the town. I am surprised that many businesses survive in a local town centre when you start looking at business rates, the massive growth in employment law and the restrictions that they've put on people in employing people, and then if you do manage to make any profit, the taxation you face. It's
nigh on impossible.
It is close to impossible. And this is somebody who's created multiple businesses. Like, I know how to create businesses. I'm pretty good at it. Yeah. This is the only reason this will survive and cope is because we don't really need it to make money because it's to support our football team. But we have a lot of empty shops in our town centre, and then things open, they close very quickly. Because of the unproductive class, which is essentially putting all these barriers and bureaucracy in the way of people creating businesses. We need to get away from that. We need a productive class. Yeah. And we've lost that. We're losing it. Yeah. And that, to me, is part of the direction we're being sent on. Yeah. And then so you put that in there, and then they print the money, and as they print the money, we get inflation. And you can't store wealth in fiat money anymore, in pounds. So what do people do? They buy properties. So the properties are unaffordable by the youngsters. Yeah. Like, got to get these basic economics back. And to me, that goes back to traditionalism. Yeah. Traditional economic policies.
Yeah. And look, I mean, I am with you. I'm not somebody that works in a waged employment, and I really don't see myself as being able to kind of work in an office 9 to 5. But
you're unemployable now.
Yeah, I mean, probably. But people that do are scared. For them, it's a huge leap to come onto this side, which is be your own boss in a family-run business because of all these barriers. And people that try it very quickly go bankrupt. So say my cousin who runs those shop fronts look at South End High Street. It's just, it's a shell, an empty shell of what it used to be. With so many empty storefronts, and you've got these knife gangs running about. Just yesterday, there was another incident.
I saw the one at the car on the car.
Yeah. Machetes. Yeah. So I 100% agree with you, because also if we end up with none of these small family businesses, what we end up with is wage slaves. We become wage slaves. We become people that are working for big corporates or small corporates or even medium-sized for a wage paycheck at the end of the month. And of course, what happens in that situation is you become fully dependent on pleasing your superiors. So when they say put a mask on, when they say you can't come into work unless you take this jab, most people cannot survive month to month without that paycheck. They don't have savings because the inflation has come destroyed all our savings. So they end up compelled as wage slaves to follow the bidding of their superiors in these companies. And the problem with BlackRock, Vanguard, and all these kind of big funds globally is that most of these companies that people are working for all ultimately come under one of these larger funds, and the policies all set centrally around the world. This is why they all impose those mask mandates and jab mandates. And so you end up, and of course the states know better, it did the same, so the NHS all had to do it, and the military had to do it in the US. So you end up in a situation where we are effectively wage slaves. And I look at that from a kind of an analytical lens, and I think, well, how was that any different to Pharaoh in Pharaoh's days, when he owned everything? Because that's what we're heading towards.
Well, I've heard people say this is just the new form of communism. Yeah. Historic communism was, as you know, the state owns the mediums of production, but they kind of own the medium of production anyway. Yeah, through taxation, through legislation, through lack of free speech, through all the control mechanisms. They're just different control mechanisms, because you cannot come out as an overt communist now. Yeah, and so that's what we live in now. But look, listen. I think I'm on the same page as you. Yeah, I want to see change, and I want to see a better future for this country. Otherwise, I'll just get the fuck out of it.
Well, so there's work to be done. The work to be done is we've got to get, we saw what happened with these riots. We've got to get the kind of lads that came out protesting migration. We've got to recognize there's a legitimate conversation, and that there should be an avenue for them to express that. Let that be, for example, Reform Party, whatever it is. The Muslim guys that came out dressed in black to defend their mosques and what have you, there's a constituency there. We've got to start having these conversations and trying to build this new Britain. And it's going to require work, serious work, and it's going to require partners in that work. So let this be the beginning of that. But there's a lot of work, I'm sure you agree, Peter, that there's a lot of work ahead of us, because we literally have to build a new country. The old order is dying. It's not going to come back. And the new country is going to look very different to what it used to look like. It's going to look that's just inevitable. But if we participate in that conversation, it will look a bit like what we want to. But if we refuse to participate, instead start, basically trying to burn it down, then of course that's not going to lead any of us anywhere. We've got children, and we want them to have children, and we want to see our grandchildren living in a safe country.
Well, listen, I'm on the same page as you. I think we should continue this conversation.
Yep.
Over the coming months. I'm going to be here all the time.
Good.
I think I need to go away and like collect my thoughts and think about like what I can add to this. I mean, you seem pretty clear on what you're going to be doing, but I hope I can add to this. I want to be part of this because like I said to you at the very start, I've had a great life in Bedford, and it's a multicultural society, and this isn't going to change. We're not going to go backwards. We're not going back to Saxon eras, right? This is the future, so we're just going to make it better. And look, I'm here for the fight, man.
Well, it's good to talk to you.
Yeah, good to talk to you again, man. Thanks for coming in.
100%. Let's carry on the conversation.
Yeah, appreciate you.
Yeah.
Right,
and
bro.
are you based here now?
This is us. This is us. Soho, London. Every interview's in person. We're not going to. I think there's one scenario where I would like do a remote interview, and it'd be someone like Snowden because he can't leave Russia and I can't go there. That's about the only scenario. Every interview in person, and I want to talk to the most interesting people here around the world. But I want to I want to have the conversations that try and fix this broken trajectory we're on.
Well, I'm working on the next project, which I'd like to brief you on very quickly.
Yeah, tell me.
And it's the idea is one of the things we noticed in the kind of current climate that we've just described is there's an online direction that's going that way, and some of it's being hijacked deliberately to go that way, and then there's a corporate media direction that's going that way, and they're forking, and they still both believe the other is mad. Yeah. And they're not really, they're talking cross purposes. So we're working on a show. We're tentatively calling it Cancelled. And the idea is to try, having the kind of global LBC background that I do, so having come from the corporate media environment, but now very firmly on an independent online media space, is to try and, that fork that we believe is exponentially growing, and so just look at the US political presidential race, and you think that you've got on the one hand the Kamala side, who they still think Trump is going to be a dictator and is a threat to democracy, an existential threat that needs to be ended at any cost, just another attempted assassination on last night, right? So that's an example of the polarization. So Cancelled as a project that some production company called Akashic Productions basically asked me to host with them and work on with them, and we're working on that. And the idea will be to try and bridge that gap so that have a networked show if we can. Obviously, there's many obstacles in the way, but the idea will be to try and have a networked show that has a long-form conversation, but going to a quote-unquote mainstream audience with some of those voices that have been cancelled to explain themselves. So whether it's a...
Love it.
Yeah, well, so whoever, think of any name that's been cancelled. The idea would be like, whether it's a George Galloway or a Tucker Carlson or a Candice or whoever, to say to them, look, there's lots of stuff you say that people find confusing. Yeah, let's have a serious conversation with no gotcha moments, just a long form conversation, allowing you to go into some of that, but with a serious interview. So it's not just going to be Tucker meets Putin and lets him say, so no, let's have a proper interview where you're asked questions about this that an interviewer would, a return to journalism, but in a 60-minute style. So it's not going to be, soundbite, clickbait, gotcha moment. What used to be considered journalism, you'd have a long-form conversation. You'd allow the person their answers to breathe, and you'd have a human conversation even where you disagree. But the idea would be to find people whose voices have been cancelled, provide that platform and try and allow for that corporate mainstream audience to re-access those voices so that they don't remain in their echo chambers. Mm-hmm. We're working on that. We've had a few names sign up. We're kind of at the stage now where we'll start approaching networks as well for that show idea. So watch this space. Hopefully that develops into something.
Well, I'm expecting to get cancelled in the next few months.
Well,
so I'll be in touch.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it's one of the things I've been really worried about with the show is that, because of my conservative values or traditional values, that anyone who is maybe from the left just sees me as some kind of right-wing, ultra-conservative Tory. And what I really want to do is just get across them some of their economic frameworks are wrong. If they get those right, they'll realise actually we have similar values. Yeah. We just disagree on the economics, and hopefully that they realise their framework's wrong. But we'll see. Yeah. It's a learning exercise for me, going from just a siloed single subject to broad. It takes a lot of work. But listen, look, we'll carry on. I look forward to the new show, and all the best. I appreciate you coming in, man.
Thanks, man.
Thank you, everybody.